Hi everybody, this is Jordan, one of your two TAs. This video is the first of two videos about the Thomas Piketty reading, Capital in the 21st Century, which you read for this week. These videos are designed to give you a sort of broad overview of the argument of this book, which is much longer and denser than what you saw in the excerpts that you read. A couple things to say about Piketty just right off the bat. The first is that this is not really an economics course. It's ultimately an English course. But we are thinking about economic themes, and specifically about how these different literary texts, which come from over 200 years in very different cultural contexts, think about inequality and represent the lived experience of people in unequal societies. So that's just to say you don't need to worry too much about the technicalities, especially the economic and mathematical technicalities of Piketty's argument. We're just trying to understand the story that he tells about the history of inequality on a more intuitive level. Because the primary reason that this book is included in the syllabus is two reasons. The first is just that it really has created quite a splash and has given it's sort of changed the conversation about inequality. So it's just a way of anchoring the class in that larger conversation. And the second one is just that it's because it has such a broad historical sweep, and because Piketty himself really combines material from lots of different contexts. As you've probably noticed, he really likes to cite classic novelists, for example. It gives us a great way of kind of having an overall skeleton and framework for the whole course that ties everything together. So that's what we're going for here. There'll be two videos. The first one is primarily about the history and economics, and then the second one is more about the culture and literature and how Piketty is relating to the text that we'll be reading in this class. So that's just see that as a warning that this first lecture is going to be a little bit more heavy on the data and the history. I find that stuff super interesting, but if you don't, bear with me. You get through this video, you get to the second one, it's going to be much more about the literature, if that's more your jam. So first, let's just talk about the big picture of Piketty's argument. So the main historical claim the book makes, and certainly the one that has been picked up the most in the media, is that 19th century capitalism, much like the economic forms that preceded it, the feudal and agrarian societies of Europe, and which were very similar in class structure to societies all across the globe. This early capitalism was characterized by extreme inequality. A small number of people owned the vast majority of the wealth. In the early and middle of the 20th century, argues Piketty, a series of, he uses the word shocks, which is a very economist way of talking about things. Anything outside of the norm is a shock. A series of shocks, most notably the First and Second World War, but also some economic crises, revolutions, and political reforms, compressed inequality, especially in the United States and Europe. And then the final sort of bit of the Piketty story is that since about 1980, inequality has been on the rise again, to the point that in some countries it has even surpassed its pre-1920 level. So this is a famous graph that comes from Piketty's book. I'm not sure if it was, I don't think it was in the section that you read, because we had to cut some for the because the class has been compressed because of the online version. But there's a decent chance that you've seen it on Twitter or in the news. It's very famous. It gets reposted a lot. But this is Piketty's U-shaped curve. So basically, it starts in the 1910s, because this is when the United States has an income tax, and so we have income records going back to about 1910. And as you can see, that it has a high level before about 1940, roughly. It dramatically drops, it stays at a lower level, and then it starts rising again at about 1980. And this is what this is charting specifically is the share of all the national income of the United States that's going to the top 10%, the top decile. And one of the things that is very important for Piketty is thinking about what causes this change. So you'll notice that he really wants to point out that there was nothing automatic about the fact that economic inequality decreased in this period. He challenges a sort of simplistic view that was popular for economists for a while in the 20th century, that once societies became fully developed, inequality would naturally go down. He wants to argue instead that it was really a series of very dramatic political events that caused it to compress. So just looking at this graph, you can see here are some key events. The Great Depression is right here. Right after the Great Depression, we get World War II. That is the moment of the biggest compression in the United States. And then this period of a low level is characterized by policies designed to reduce inequality. Most notably, the top income tax never goes below 70% in this period. So that's a big point for Piketty, that it doesn't. There's nothing quote unquote automatic that will cause inequality to go down. However, Piketty does want to argue that there are some underlying economic laws that push inequality in a certain direction. So the most famous one, and sort of the core of the book, is what he calls R greater than G. And I'll just quote from the book. If the rate of return on capital R remains significantly above the growth rate for an extended period of time, then the risk of divergence in the distribution of wealth is very high. So again, not an economics class, so you don't need to worry about understanding this in any technical sort of way, but just in an intuitive way. The basic claim here is that if the rate of return on capital, so that is just the amount of money you get for owning things, the return you get for investing your money in the stock market, in whatever, if that amount remains significantly above the growth rate, so the amount that the whole economy is increasing for an extended period of time, then it's likely that inequality will increase. And he has another quote that sort of like goes into this that I'll just share with you. He says, "Capital-dominated societies in the past, with hierarchies largely determined by inherited wealth, a category that includes both traditional rural societies and the countries of 19th century Europe, can arise and subsist only in low-growth regimes." So his point here is just that really, really unequal societies where inherited wealth really drives, societies really built around inherited wealth, the people with inherited wealth in 19th century societies were often the only ones who could vote. They controlled the government. This sort of society, he argues, really depends on economic growth being relatively low. The idea being that if, let's go to the next slide to talk about that. So why would it matter what growth is for inequality? So here's how Piketty explains it. In a society where output per capita grows tenfold every generation, it is better to count on what one can earn and save from one's own labor, because the income of previous generations is small compared with current income. So again, no reason to try and fret too much about this in any technical sort of way, but just intuitively it makes sense that if the amount of stuff that the economy can make is like growing at a really fast rate, then the amount that your parents can bequeath to you is less important than what you can earn from doing something on your own, whether that's something more entrepreneurial, starting a business, whatever, or whether that's working, education, and it's something that you do that you didn't inherit from your parents. Because if there's more money to be made outside of inheritance, then inheritance at a society level is going to be less important. Another reason why he thinks that growth is an important mitigating factor for inequality is that a growing economy is one that has lots of new functions constantly being created and new skills being needed. So the idea here, again, it's pretty simple. It's just that when an economy is growing, that means new industries are emerging where people are being rewarded for different things than they were rewarded for before. The idea there is that even if you got rich doing one thing, the next generation will get rich doing something else, and so inequality will not turn into this sort of like aristocratic version where inheritance is the only thing that matters. It's a bit of an empirical question, the degree to which that is actually true, because of course just because whatever your parents got rich from is no longer the main industry. You could just invest your inheritance in whatever that is, but that's something that Piketty talks about. But another thing that Piketty really wants to explore is the fact that growth is really a modern phenomenon. So prior to about 1800, it just was always the case that R was greater than G because G was always very low. So this is a chart that Piketty alludes to, but he doesn't share with you in the reading. This is produced by the economist Angus Maddison, and it's a chart that's just showing GDP per capita growth in a series of countries since 1000 AD. So an enormous amount of history is captured by this graph. It's sometimes called the hockey stick graph because it has this really dramatic rise right at the end. So as you can see from looking at this, the growth is really a modern phenomenon. The feudal and aristocratic societies of Europe and all over the world, there were similar sorts of social relations in other places like China and India that could arguably be described as feudal. But all across the world, there really wasn't growth in the sense that we think of it today of a society increasing the amount of stuff that it makes year after year, and its capacity to make stuff with less work. That really doesn't happen until in Britain. It happens, sometime in the 18th century, and then really takes off in the 19th, and then everywhere else in the world really doesn't take off until the 20th century. In worlds before, in all the societies before this level of growth, R was always greater than G, just because you can see there wasn't very much growth going on at all. So this shift really is hard to overstate the scale of this shift in terms of human history. So one thing I wanted to just point out is where some of the historical readings that we'll be doing next week lie on this graph. So you can see Smith and Bentham are right here at the end of the 18th century. I've pointed out where they are on the Britain point of the graph. Then we have Malthus. 1798 is when he publishes his essay on the principles of population, and then Marx and Engels right in the middle of the 19th century. And the thing that I just wanted you to think about here is all of these people whose work we'll be reading were really living through the Industrial Revolution and the beginning of this period of sustained growth that was unprecedented in human history. By 1800, everybody in Europe knew that the world was changing in a big way, but nobody really knew what exactly was going to happen. They knew that the world was never going to look the same, but what world would it be? And there were a lot of political questions that emerged because of these changes. How would the new world be governed? Who would enjoy the wealth that this new world was capable of producing? These were not just like abstract philosophical questions, but were really live political debates at the time that were being worked out in argument and in political conflict. So I really want us to think about the historical situatedness of these writers and how they were really trying to understand the world that they were living in and the political conflicts that they saw around them as responses to this huge change of human societies in the 19th century. Okay, but back to Piketty. So one of the things that, the more pessimistic things that Piketty points out is that the period of very rapid growth seems to be slowing. So since the 1970s and 1980s, growth has slowed and inequality has risen. And if we are thinking about Piketty's formula, that inequality rises when R is greater than G, that would seem to be one factor that's driving towards greater inequality in the future. So just the quick and dirty story is just that Piketty points out that our economy is much more driven by services than the economies of the early 20th century and 19th century were. So whereas in earlier kind of capitalism, the most dynamic sectors of the economy were manufacturing, you see lots of growth in manufacturing because it's really easy to rationalize and automate the production of manufactured goods. And so there's very high growth. Over time, we get better and better at making iPhones, and so they get cheaper. But that's not really true of the services. It still takes a barber the same amount of time to trim your hair today as it did in 1800. That's the example that Piketty uses. Another one that gets thrown around that I find very fun is string quartets. It still takes a string quartet, exactly 4 people, the exact same amount of time to play a live concert today as it did in 1800. And then another one that hits a little close to home is teaching. This is something that is hard to automate, although we're experiencing virtual teaching right now, so maybe we're seeing the end of that era. Given the career I'm moving into, fingers crossed that's not the case. But the reason that Piketty brings this up is he's arguing that this is another reason why inherited wealth seems poised to become important in our society again. Because if growth is slow, especially if growth in income is slow for people in the middle and the bottom, then the gap between the bottom and the top is going to expand because the people at the top see their incomes growing faster than everyone else's. And so the sort of claim that Piketty wants us to consider is that maybe inherited wealth will become once again important in politics and culture and in everyday life in the way that it was in the 19th century. And his favorite examples for what that might look like is classic novels. So the novels of Jane Austen and Balzac depict worlds of a people really concerned about inheritance, where who you marry and what kind of wealth you can marry into, as well as what kind of wealth you can inherit from your family, has a huge determining role in what opportunities you have, what social communities you'll be a part of, and what your life will just basically look like. And Piketty wants us to consider whether the world of Austen has come back in the 21st century. But of course, there are some important differences between 19th century inequality and contemporary inequality. And the biggest one that Piketty points out is what he calls supermanagers. So historical inequality is all about property. So in the worlds of Austen and Balzac, if you're rich, it means you own lots of stuff and you make income from owning that stuff. Today, while that's still true, there are also a large class of people who are rich both from the fact that they own stuff and also from the fact that they have a huge salary. And Piketty calls these people supermanagers. He says it's most dramatic in the United States and Britain, but you see people whose salaries for being the CEO of some corporation is enormous, and that's how they become rich. So today we might say that the sort of symbol of the very rich is less the sort of Austinian protagonist, someone who marries into wealth, and more somebody who is the head of some huge corporation. Of course, that's not a total difference, because there are still people who are rich from inheritance, but that's something else that Piketty lays down. And tying that into the readings for the course, we can see in the final reading for the course, Parasite, a movie from last year, a Korean movie by Bong Joon-ho, the symbol of wealth there is Mr. Park, who is some kind of unspecified businessman. We don't get a lot of details for how he makes his money, but we do get the impression that he's not just this sort of like idle rich inherited his wealth. He's some sort of like lawyer or CEO or something, and that is an important difference in how the class conflict between the poor family and the rich family plays out. And so that's something we'll want to be thinking about throughout the class, is how inequality is both the same and different when we're comparing these different societies and different historical periods. So I just wanted to end with the sort of like cultural dimension as a segue into what I'll be talking about in the next video, where I'm really going to be unpacking Piketty's reliance on historical and literary data for his arguments, and then also talk about how his story relates to the text that we'll be reading for this class. So that's up next time, and I will talk to you all then.